I'd like to share something which I learned while on my way from my home in Gedam Road. I found one person expressing his strong feelings about the President of the United States, President Trump. He was standing on Paul Street, waving something. I am talking about a strong message to everyone who was driving by like me. I remember his strong statement. I live to lie, Trump crossing. That's an extraordinary statement. That's the beauty of being an American citizen in the United States. If you know something about my background, you might not be surprised why I am not a First Amendment voluntarily. The more freedom we have, the better. As you might imagine, the United States, my adopted country, is the only country with all kinds of amazing, how can I say, commercial services, commercial products. We are the only country with Twitter. We are the only country with Facebook, Microsoft. What else you can imagine? Think about my native country, South Korea. I left South Korea in the late May of 1980. I came to the United States largely because the United States, at least 4 years ago, was the land of freedom and opportunity. As a college student, at least that was the only thing which was on my mind when I left South Korea in late May of 1980. To me, at least my adopted country is very much like the land of freedom and opportunity. That's the message I'd like to share with you. Based on my first experience in South Korea, when I left South Korea, there was no such a thing as freedom of expression. I was almost kicked out of college, largely because of my involvement in anti-government demonstrations in the 1970s. Participating in anti-government demonstrations in South Korea in the 1970s was something rather unusual. If you are a discerning college student, you were supposed to participate to express your strong feelings against the brutal military dictatorship. That was the 1970s. I was drafted into the Korean Army virtually overnight. The South Korean government under President Park Chung-hee wanted to teach me Korean democracy 101. I served in the Korean Army for 33 months and 15 days. I always counted the days. I sometimes was beaten up physically, mentally and psychologically. I was abused. That was a tough life. Maybe that was the message I was supposed to take into account when I left, when I was discharged from the Korean Army in the late 1976. But again, I got involved in some kind of on-campus demonstrations against the South Korean government. If my university president did not personally and directly intervene or intercede on my behalf, I would not be here with you to speak about freedom of expression in South Korea. But the life has not to do with some kind of random things. Life is not always planned out. Maybe that is the beauty of life. That's what I feel. And for this opportunity, I'd like to say thanks to the Eugene Library. And this kind of civic conversation engagement is still very important, especially when freedom of expression is often challenged. And indeed, freedom of expression should be challenged. Otherwise, what's the point of having a democracy? Especially when we say our country is a functioning democracy. This is some bioinformation, and I'd like to appreciate some of my School of Journalism and Communication colleagues' presence in the audience. This is the Bill of Rights, as you probably know. As a naturalized citizen, I always carry the US Constitution. I do not know how many times I read this. This is always making something different. Whenever I read it, I am talking about the US Constitution. This Constitution is the shortest Constitution. At the same time, the longest Constitution of the world. I am talking about 2,440 words, excluding 27 amendments. When we talk about 27 amendments, in addition to the original Constitution, we are talking about 7,818 words. Our Constitution is slightly more than 200 words. I am talking about the Constitution, especially the First Amendment, ratified on December 15th, 1791. The First Amendment, I think, is making our country different in so many different ways. Indeed, Lizzie Bollinger, president of the University of Columbia University. By the way, she is one of our most distinguished University of Oregon alumni. She said this about the First Amendment. More broadly, freedom of expression. The First Amendment is making the United States exceptional, which is making the United States stand out from the rest of the world. To be brutally honest with you, I am wondering whether our President of the United States, President Trump, read the Constitution of 4,400 words, not necessarily the whole text of 7,800 words. And also the First Amendment. First Amendment is very brief, amazingly concise. I am talking about 45 words. Out of a 45 word, the First Amendment Constitution, I am talking about 14 words. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Every nation has something similar to this. Even North Korea. What about China? Especially all the authoritarian countries has amazing embellishment relating to freedom of expression and freedom of the press. But each of the 14 word guarantee of freedom of expression under our Constitution means something. There is no such a thing as redundancy in our Constitution. The freedom of speech, all of the press. But we are still struggling to find out the true real-life meaning of what is the freedom, what is the speech, and what is the press. I cannot say everything about the 14-word guarantee of freedom of expression today, largely because I am time constrained. But freedom of expression is not absolute. It is regulated by all kinds of regulations like time and in this room. That's right. He is Lizzie Bollinger, Columbia University. And I am talking about the book published 1 year ago to celebrate the centennial anniversary of the First Amendment. And these two leading scholars, President Bollinger of Columbia University and Professor Jeffrey Stone of University of Chicago Law School, published a book called the free speech century. In commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the first Supreme Court case called Schenck versus United States, and a couple of the cases in 1919, especially relating to the Espionage Act of 1917. So at least you think about the history of the First Amendment. There was almost nothing between 1791, when the First Amendment was ratified, and 1919. But in the past slightly more than 100 years, we are talking about the blessed, extraordinary evolution. Let me use the word revolution of freedom of expression in our country. And this book is something I'd like to recommend to you. If you are thinking about whether we can imagine the past and remember the future in the context of our exceptional First Amendment. At least this is what I usually say. If we are wanting to know a little bit about ourselves, we should know what other people are doing. Otherwise, we might well be too complacent, assuming or claiming that we are the best of the world. Even though we are really the best of the world, we have to do better what we are doing. Otherwise, other people will do better. That's something I'd like to say when I teach comparative media law. About 10 years ago, Vice General Counsel of the New York Times, David McCullough, said, if you're studying law, you have to know. And it's the 3 I's. 3 I's means international law, internal law, and intellectual property. But think about what is specifically mentioned in international law. That is giving us something to think about. Our country is part of the world. We cannot do everything in our own way without thinking about our actions, implications, or ramifications for the global society. This is what I'm wanting you to think about. Global Press Freedom Index. It has been released by the Reporters Without Borders. It is often called as RSF, Reporters Sans Frontier. In 2019, according to the Reporters Without Borders survey of global freedom, our country's record is not impressive. You can see the United States here. It is yellow. Of course, we are not black. That's something we are doing better. China. I am sorry, I can't show you that much about my native country, South Korea. It is yellow. It means South Korea and the United States are in the same kind of category, more or less. Not as good as it should be, not as fairly good as it should be. The United States is more or less problematic. We are not at the top of the global press freedom ranking. That's something we have to think about. The United States was not really that good 3 years ago. We have to think about it. The United States ranking is just down and down. Yep. South Korea is better than the United States, correct? Yes, here. Number 48, yes. Out of 180 countries. South Korea is definitely better than the United States 41. You might wonder, what are the criteria relating to this kind of survey? RSF is looking at all kinds of things instead of only one thing: media pluralism, media self-censorship, media independence, abuse, and attacks on journalists. What about access to information for journalists? Think about what happened last year in Annapolis, Maryland. 5 people were killed by someone who didn't like the media. I am talking about the massacre of journalists in the, I think, Capital Gazette. But at least it is giving you some perspective on why the United States was dropped 3 places from 1918 or 1917. So at least it is giving you some perspective. South Korea was one of the shining examples of Americans' successful export of democracy. South Korea learned a lot from the United States, even though South Koreans paid a high price. And about 1.5 years, almost 2 years ago, I wrote something for our local newspaper, Register Guard. Our country should learn something from South Korea about democracy. But that is a different story. But at least this is giving some perspective. Yep. US is serving as the beacon of a free press, and at least that is what I'm talking about. Problematic. It is quite a detailed analysis of which countries are doing better than the United States or worse. But still, we have to think about what is going on globally in comparison with our press freedom record at the moment. So yeah, I say I'd like to just point to this webpage specifically giving you all the information about global press freedom ranking. Fight the fake news. Fake news is now part of everyday lexicon, not only in the United States, but all over the world. Indeed, the phrase fake news is always at the top. If you Google it, amazingly, it means everyone knows what is fake, if not necessarily news. That is amazing, yes. So I say at least this is something. And you can see what our president is doing. Yeah. He's using directly communicating, I say using all kinds of social media, especially Twitter, and the fight of fake news. It is very difficult to define what is fake news. Fake news, usually we have to think about some kind of deliberate, intentional, rather than inadvertent, unexpected mistake in the news coverage. So when we talk about the fake news, we are talking about real fake news, not fake news. Think about it. But at least President Trump definitely added fake news to our daily vocabulary, whether politically or ideologically skewed or not. That's something I've found, and I thought it might be giving you something to think about. It is just somewhere. It was published in a newspaper. But the question is whether the media, especially news media, especially mainstream media, are the enemies of the American people. I think there is something true to me. Of course, our presidents, more often than not, did not like the news media. If they loved the news media, something was definitely wrong with the news media of the United States. There should be some kind of a confrontation. There should be some kind of an uneasy relationship between the news media and the president. That is why the news media, especially the press, is serving as the fourth branch outside the three branches of the government. We are talking about checks and balances. That is something which should be part of our democracy. I am talking about whether the press can serve as a watchdog under the three-branch government of the United States. If we can say our democracy is continuing to thrive. I'd like to mention two books, largely because fake news has a lot to do with the First Amendment. Absolutely. Already mentioned David Macro. He's now serving Deputy General Counsel of the New York Times. Not surprisingly, last year, there was more than one book. And this book, The First Amendment in the Trump era. Timothy Zig. He's a professor at William and Mary. And if you look at the two books, there are more commonalities and differences. Of course, I can say David Macro's book is a lot more readable. He was a journalist before going to law school. And his comments about the real-life work as an in-house lawyer for the New York Times is just giving us something more than just esoteric, abstract analysis or discussion of the First Amendment in the newsroom. Now, the First Amendment in the Trump era, I agree with him. I am talking about Professor Timothy Zig. He says, based upon his research, that the First Amendment, as attacked, sometimes as demonized, I'm talking about the media by President Trump, will be some kind of the defining element of the Trump presidency in the future of the United States. As I said, the First Amendment is defining our country, especially when we want to say something about the government, especially against the government. And also, if we are wanting to hold the powers that be to account, that is what democracy is all about. The question is, why and how our president is challenging the media. Sometimes very selectively. But don't think about freedom of the press or freedom of speech separately from what the President of the United States is doing. President of the United States does have a First Amendment right, absolutely. But believe it or not, when you look at the Constitution of the United States, Article 2, Section 1, President Trump, 3 years ago, took the oath saying he will preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That is his oath, which he took on the inauguration day. The question is what he has been doing is violation of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. There are all kinds of different ways to look at. But at least I can just pinpoint some of the things which give us some kind of a sobering moment. That's what can candidate, Trump said, I am going to open libel laws so people can sue the media. In 1964, there was a revolution. The revolution was through the reinterpretation of freedom of speech and the press by the Supreme Court of the United States in the landmark case, truly the landmark case in our country of the Supreme Court of the United States. In New York Times versus Sullivan, the Supreme Court said Americans should be uninhibited, wide open, and robust in expressing their views about the government of the United States, more specifically, government officials. We are talking about the central meaning of the First Amendment. When we are prohibited from speaking something critical, nasty, and sometimes false, not deliberately, not intentionally, that kind of margin of error for falsehood should be part of the central meaning of the First Amendment. That's the extraordinary statement from the Supreme Court of the United States. I am talking about the unanimous decision of the court in New York Times versus Sullivan. The inspirational impact of New York Times versus US is unmistakable. Every country is looking at the United States through the kind of ruling. Of course, we can say the New York Times versus the US of 1971, I am talking about Pentagon Papers case, it is definitely more widely known throughout the world because it dramatized the confrontation between the administration of the Nixon administration and the New York Times and the Washington Post. But at least we talk about this. Seditious libel incompatible with the First Amendment. I think that is very important to keep in mind. At least when we allow the government and the government officials to abuse or misuse defamation law to punish people, largely because they didn't want other people to know what other people think about them. That is very dangerous. I should say it is more or less un-American. A prominent First Amendment scholar, Harry Kelvin Jr., at the University of Washington Law School, he said this, which I still keep in mind. When we talk about why the United States is different, he said basically this: you can criminalize something, but not seditious libel, criticism of the government in the United States. Simply because if you punish someone as a critic of the government, that's the end of our democracy, as we envisioned our democracy in the 1700s. I think that is really important. If we allow the government, especially the President of the United States, to put people who they think are critics in jail, where do you think we can do? I am talking about, what about the role of the press? That's quite a scary scenario, which should not be acceptable in our democracy. Now this. The bold challenge to the media system. I am talking about media organization. At least
Look at this, with all of the fake news coming out of NBC and the networks, at what point is it appropriate to challenge their license? Bad for country. I wish President Trump had taken communication law at the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication. My students know about the licensing. It is given by FCC, yes. Of course, there is a government license. But NBC has nothing to do with the licensing requirement. It is a network. Individually, the TV station is required to have a license. That's a different story. But think about this. What is leading him to think about it? On the basis or in the name of fake news media should be revoked their licenses. That's far more than what is allowed by the First Amendment. Even though the electronic media is more or less second citizens as compared with print media. But at least that's quite extraordinary. Now what about this? Access to the president and more to the government agencies. The communication for the media to the public about the President of the United States. I am sure these two pictures are kind of epitomizing the more or less malfunctioning of the White House communication. Of course, White House people say that President Trump is having more communication with the public. The president does not need the kind of regular daily press briefing by his spokesperson, because he's constantly 24/7 real-time communicating with the public through Twitter. But that is not the way the system should work. I'm not talking about the legal requirement for the president to speak with the public through the media as part of their duty and obligation to the American public. But we are talking about the known tradition, usage, custom between the President of the United States and the press. I am talking about decent sense of decency, mutual respect, and trust between the President and the established media, or even not established media. So I think that is important. For the past almost 10 months, there has been no significant communication between the White House Correspondents Association and the press secretary of the President of the United States. A little more legal context. I am sure you know who this gentleman is. He is afraid to come to the United States. He has no freedom to travel around. He is in jail. His name is Julian Assange. That's right. He is the founder of WikiLeaks. The fundamental question for Julian Assange, for us, who are teaching media law, and also people who are thinking about freedom of the press very seriously, has a lot to do with how to deal with Julian Assange, how to define his status. He should be treated as a journalist or someone else. That is something we have to think about. News gathering. Under the Espionage Act, I mentioned briefly the Espionage Act of 1917. It contributed to the clarification, interpretation, and expansion of the First Amendment, largely because it was very important federal law during the time of World War I. As you can see in the title of the federal law, it is relating to espionage. When you understand the ordinary meaning of espionage, it has nothing to do with publishing information by the media or through the media. That is what is now being debated. Even those who don't like what Julian Assange did using Charles Manson are really worried about the extraordinary implications of Julian Assange's indictment. The question is whether the espionage can be used or misused or abused against journalistic activities. When we understand the current anti-media, shall I say, toxic environment, we have to think about whether it is now more probable rather than possible when it comes to application of the Espionage Act to journalists. That's why I say right now journalists are treated as the enemies of the American public. Sometimes they are treated as traitors, yes. When you talk about whistleblowers, whistleblowers are doing something extraordinary in many ways. That is what we talk about the reality. Now, Freedom of Information Act. Freedom of Information Act was the third statutory recognition of the public's right to know, even though I am talking about the third Freedom of Information Act in the world, 200 years earlier than we did. Sweden recognized the right to know through access to government records. But in 1966, we got the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. A right to information, less transparent, especially in the past 3 years. The thinking among the government officials, especially who are in charge of handling FOIA requests, are thinking that FOIA requests are more or less obstructing their work, the governing process, instead of helping the public to understand better what the government agencies are doing. So more secretive and less transparent. That is something we have to think about, how the FOIA has been handled. So I said, at least, that is what we say. Some people say FOIA requests are more often weaponized to harass President Trump and his government. But again, that's something we have to think about. But at least, the FOIA, I say, right to know about the government through the access to government records is not a constitutional right. It is a statutory right. Congress can do whatever they want. If they want, the FOIA is no longer relevant to our governing process. It means our Freedom of Information law is not as protective of our right to know in our democracy than many other countries. And at least, if you look at the global assessment or evaluation of the FOIA when it comes to the text, not necessarily its application. It is really fascinating. Look at this. FOIA, not an access-friendly law. Attorney Toby Mendel, he came to the School of Journalism and the University of Oregon to give a speech about the freedom of expression 1 year ago. And he is the director of the Center for Law and Democracy in Canada. And he is giving all kind of annual evaluation of all kind of unending change or revisions of more than 120 countries globally. And when it comes the textual protection or guarantee of information access in the United States, we are not in the top of 120 plus countries. I'm talking 128 countries, I think. Yes. But the United States is ranked number 72. Yes. That's rather problematic. Our law doesn't require someone, for whatever reason, who refuses to or denies the FOIA request to be punished. The government is not required by law to release information more than what they are required to do. Not really affirmative approach. FOIA is reactive rather than proactive. And also the White House and the federal courts, Congress don't have to worry about any kind of impact of the FOIA. But many other countries require the three branches of the government to comply with the FOIA. So the scope of our freedom of information law is less than extensive. So that's something we have to think of. Also, FOIA is usually secondary when there is a conflict between the FOIA and the specific law which requires withholding of certain government records. Now, a little more global, understanding of our freedom of the press. President Trump's fake news is now widely accepted or used to argue that news should be punished, depending on how the government are thinking about fake news. Because what we are probably the most important, I say, influential country, politically, economically, geographically, I say geopolitically, I should say, and also what culturally, whatever President of the United States is doing will be given careful consideration by all the other people outside the United States. So if our president is doing something which is rather restrictive, that kind of restrictive measure by the President of the United States will be immediately adopted by many countries. Look at a number of countries which are already, I'm talking about the prohibition on fake news as a crime, especially Singapore, also the Philippines. The Philippines was a colony of the United States, and it was supposed to be a thriving democracy, but not anymore. A lot more authoritarian than you might imagine. And not surprisingly, the Philippines and the Singapore embraced fake news as something which should not be allowed. And a couple days ago, I am talking about January 16th, the Supreme Court of Singapore refused to allow an open court challenge to the constitutionality of the new Singaporean fake news. So that is but we talk about the global implication of President Trump's never-ending demonization of the news media as conveyor of fake news. Now, this is interesting. What's wrong with the First Amendment? It is a book I'm using for my communication law class right now. What's wrong with the First Amendment? The book was published in 2016. Professor Steve Schifrin, he's now retired as a law professor at Cornell University. But he said the First Amendment is protecting more, not less. When it comes to all kinds of speech which should not be protected at all, I am talking about hate speech. Too much protection of false defamatory defamation. What about sexual explicit material? What about advertisement? All kinds of other things which he was very disturbed about. That is why he wanted to change whether the First Amendment should be understood as traditionally done, or it should be re-evaluated or re-examined. And there is something what might be possible if President Trump will continue to reshape the federal courts. And already 1 year ago, Justice Clarence Thomas, very conservative justice, said the actual malice rule, the fundamental defamation rule of the United States, as articulated by Justice William Bremer in New York Times versus Sullivan, should not be re-examined. Fortunately, none of the other justices said, yes, that is something we have to be positively thinking about. But at least it is giving you some perspective on what is going on. And there are so many other topics which I'd like to engage with you. But as I said, time is reality. And I have to stop in compliance with the time regulation. Thank you so much.
Do you have time for some questions?
Yes, I'd be happy to entertain any questions. I think at least in this room, I hope, I think freedom of speech and the freedom of the press should be absolutely protected, but not outside the room. Okay, please. Yes. If you don't mind, will you identify yourself?
Yes, my name is Dr. Razak Behnam, and I want to share with you that I do not share your love affair with the concept of what you talked about, because you did not separate the concept of the First Amendment with those who are supposed to protect it, which are the members of the media who are supposed to share it with the people over the years that we have had. Because this is different than, let's say, 247 years ago of our Constitution here. For instance, I wonder why, for instance, you did not mention anything about Gary Webb. Are you familiar with Gary Webb of Dark Alliances, of San Mercury, and what happened to him?
Mm-hmm.
The ownership of media has a lot to do with what happened to Gary Webb. If somebody wants to discuss, as a matter of fact, what happened recently to General Soleimani of Iran, did you notice that even the members of the media continually parrot? They have become a stenographer of the corporations and the power. They refer to the man as a monster. Here is a military man, 62 years old. What do you expect him to do? This is the same media which, as a matter of fact, your native country, American General in South Korea, haven't you heard of My Lai massacre? I mean, why didn't the members of the media refer to individuals who are responsible for My Lai massacre as monsters, as evil, without any really paying attention to what this man, Soleimani, was meant to the Iranians, the corporate media went ahead and reported it. So I do not understand this love affair without any dialectical relationship that you must connect with the concept, which is very admirable, but it is not practiced. Then what is the use?
I say, when it comes to freedom of the press means not necessarily, the responsibility of the press to give all the information about everything. Indeed, freedom of the press means, to a certain extent, irresponsible. But interestingly, when we say freedom of the press, under the First Amendment, does not say anything about a fair press. If we talk about a fair press versus a free press, it might raise a lot of different questions. When we talk about a fair press, we are talking about more or less ethical issues rather than legal issues. Of course, we have a media ethics specialist here in the audience, Professor Tom Bivens. Of course, he might jump in with some of the different thoughts, but at least there are many other ways to look at the actual or perceived bias, prejudice, or some kind of not impartial approach to news reporting. And the reality is that sometimes, even though there is a lot of space and time, but freedom of the press means that the government should not get involved in dictating what kind of stories should be given priorities versus how much, what kind of other stories should be given priority. So there is a never-ending process. And the freedom of the press should be, and is, I hope, will be never-ending process. But the process should be given deference rather than, directly dictated from outside. That's what I can say. Yeah, please.
Hey, thank you for the talk. First of all, my name is John Burstein. A comment and a question. First comment is that I'm really glad you brought up Dave McCraw's book, because in a former life I practiced law with him, and he's outstanding. I'm glad he's there, and I'm glad he's written that book. And that's a different story for the time. But it leads me to my question, which is I'm not a teacher like you are. I'm a father of 3 teenagers who I try to explain to that they're in a crazy time right now, and a time that we will in the future look back to, and it will be like Civil 1861 to 65, 1968, 9/11, these sort of big moments of our American history as to what have happened. And we don't know, the way I view it anyway, we don't know where we're at. Right now, we're living through it now. Most people know until we look back, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. So my question to you is, when you work with students and teach them, either journalism students or law students, how are you able to get across in a way that they can understand, like the teenagers, they're not at that level of education or age or whatnot, of what's going on here? I think in some ways a lot of us in the room probably agree with and are scared of what you talked about today. And people in this room, older than I, have lived through things, and I don't know if there's many people who are unfortunately younger than I am, I'm not that young. So I guess the question is, the next generation, as a professor, what do you see with the people you teach?
It is quite a daunting challenge to give some sense of relevance to my students about what I have discussed. Sometimes some of the court cases are rather too old, for them to just connect with. But still, I try to connect what is going on at the moment. It's sometimes huge what impact upon everyone. And that's why I usually discuss something in the context of global, international, and comparative perspective. And sometimes many of my students, who are mostly American, have not much exposure to what is going on outside the United States. And sometimes just exposing them, even though vicariously, to the global freedom of speech and freedom of the press issues, are still giving them some sense. And also, I'd like to use some specific examples on and off campus. And sometimes, when you talk about campus speech, and also freedom of the campus newspapers, like the Emerald, and they definitely, what connected themselves to the kind of real life, happenings. But again, it is not easy, but I am trying. If I'm not trying, something terrible wrong with me and with my students. Yes, Professor Bivens, please.
I wanted to ask you your opinion on, you mentioned that Julian Assange is probably going to be tried under the Espionage Act. What do you find more, or if you find it more, problematic, the Alien and Sedition Act or the Espionage Act? Because they're radically different. It's easier to explain the Espionage Act to somebody, but to students it's hard to explain the existence of the Alien and Sedition Act. John Adams and Woodrow Wilson did that. It's still around, that one. And that scares me more than anything else.
Yeah, I see at least, when we look at the history of, Espionage Act and of course the Sedition Act, we are talking about some kind of what terrible or dystopian record of freedom of expression. In the late 18th century, we are talking about Alien Sedition Act of 1798. And yes, I think their law, more than anything else, was politically motivated to just punish the political opponents of President Adams. And the fundamental question is whether Espionage Act of 1970 was that bad in terms of political targeting opponents. And at least espionage has been used, generally speaking, when it comes to espionage activities, which were a crime. But still the question is, so far, Espionage Act has almost never been used against journalists in the broader sense of the word. I think receiving some information with someone who is not a foreign government. When it comes to sharing information from the government leakers, I say insider leakers, with the news media, I think they should be treated as an espionage. I think that is really important. But think about this. In the United States, whistleblowers are protected under a federal law. But the whistleblower protection law in the United States is not as protective as other countries' whistleblower law. Think about the Canada. Think about South Korea. If whistleblower is indicted for violation of particular law, in those countries, whistleblowers can argue that they shared the information with the news media for the sake of the people's right to know. There is a so-called public interest defense. If Julian Assange is brought over to the United States under the Espionage Act, even if Edward Snowden is brought over to the United States under the Espionage Act, neither of them has any chance of arguing that they used the information which was arguably disclosed in violation of the Espionage Act on the basis of public interest of the Americans to right to know. That's really important. I think, I'm talking about very serious problem with our whistleblower, whistleblower protection law. So something which should be given careful attention by Congress, but at this point I doubt it. But again, very important. And we talk about the international law more or less. Whistleblowers should be able to assert their public interest arguments when they are charged with a violation of the Espionage Act, especially in the United States. But again, journalists is now a lot more, difficult to define as such. In the past, who is a journalist is easy to define, but now everybody says they are journalists. Maybe that's true, but if everybody is journalist, I can say nobody is a journalist who deserves some kind of a special protection.
Do you think that Trump and fake news improve? I have two questions. Do you think that it improved investigative journalism in any way? And two, Are there news sources that you would recognize as maybe the most unbiased, right? The outcome is biased. So I just would like to get your thoughts on those two questions.
I say fake news is definitely what challenging the news media to think a lot more seriously about how much they should dig into. And also they should always keep in mind whether they will be charged with disseminating fake news. So there is a lot more self-awareness, I think, among journalists, institutionally. So whenever they are challenged with some kind of fake news allegations, they are eager to back up with more digging and self-awareness. That is important. But when it comes to what news media is more unbiased than any other media, I cannot say too much about that. I often go to foreign news media in England, for obvious reasons, because I have some experience with English news media. And in the United States, at least, I expose myself both to Fox News and also CNN. I also read the New York Times, Washington Post as a subscriber, and also I read the Wall Street Journal to just balance my otherwise skewed approach or exposed to news media. Sometimes it is not easy to just read, watch Fox News and CNN at the same time. Yes, of course, I am watching them usually when I work out in the neighborhood gym. But still, it is one way to look at how to make yourself more unbiased rather than biased by forcing yourself to get exposed. And that is what I usually ask Martin to think about. Yeah. Oh, please.
I'm Charles Conway. I have a radio show and podcast. And the one thing that struck me, you mentioned foreign media, but we now have the United States going to RT News and saying, okay, you have to register as a foreign agent. But they don't go to BBC News and say you're a foreign agent. They don't go to Deutsche Welle News and say you're a foreign agent, or France 24, no, only Russia. And we also have the impact of social media. Now, because social media is now, for example, banning press TV from Iran. So you can't get press TV's YouTube accounts gone. You can't get them on Facebook or Twitter or anything. And it strikes me that the problem with the First Amendment, as you pointed in the book that you're using in class, is that it says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press. It doesn't say that Congress cannot make a law promoting the freedom of the press. But they don't seem to want it.
I say, in 1946, the Supreme Court of the United States, in the case of Penny Temple versus Florida, in the concurring opinion by Justice Felix Frankfurt, when he talks about the responsibility of the press, he said something like this: the framers of the Constitution, specifically the First Amendment, did not include the responsibility of the press, largely because thinking about the responsibility of the press is so obvious, and that the framers of the Constitution did not want to believe the obvious. When we talk about freedom of the press, we should always think about the responsibility of the press. Article 1, Section 8 of the Oregon Constitution specifically says, if you abuse freedom of expression, you have to pay a price. Of course, even though there is a very important textual difference between our Oregon Constitution and the first and today's Constitution, our Oregon Constitution is protecting more, not less, freedom of expression, including protection of obscenity in our state. No other state protects obscenity, as part of freedom of expression, except in our state. But when it comes the affirmative, positive role of the state, I'm talking about the government, in promoting freedom of the press, that's something great. But that is not part of the First Amendment. But at least theoretically, like Professor Owen Fish at Yale Law School, he wrote a very fascinating original first law review article in Harvard Law Review. The title of his law review article, I'm talking about Harvard Law Review article by Professor Owen Fish, is called simply, Why the State? Why the state, question mark. Why the state essentially means if freedom of speech and the freedom of the press is expanded by the government, what's the problem? And that is what other countries are doing. Instead of simply what? Thinking about passive or negative concept of press freedom, the government should actively involved to promote more rather than less freedom of the press, like promoting access to government and protecting the journalist privilege to protect the confidential sources. In the United States, as a matter of constitutional law, there is no such a thing as journalists' right to protect their confidential sources, even though it is recognized as freedom of the press in international law. That's something we have to think about. So it means we are not leading the world when it comes to freedom of the press. We are trailing the rest of the world. There is some kind of sobering message I'd like to leave with you. And thank you so much.
I think you would be willing to stick around if any of you just want to come. Thanks for coming. Thanks to the George Center Museum and to Rochester University.
Right here.